This is Jeffrey Schwarz. I made this film while I was a film student at SUNY Purchase. That's the State University of New York at Purchase. This is Joe Franklin, and if you're not from New York, you might not know who Joe Franklin is, although you might have seen him on Saturday Night Live. Billy Crystal used to do an impersonation of him. Joe is a New York talk show host who used to have people on like Al Lewis, sort of B-level celebrities. And so I thought Joe would be an appropriate person to introduce the film and to get us into the mindset of the world of Al Lewis. He had a tiny little office in Times Square in a building that I think has since been torn down since the renovation of Times Square, but his office was so packed and filled with newspapers and books and videos and films and records that there was literally nowhere to sit except right inside the doorway is where his desk was. So we actually had to put the camera outside the doorway in the hall to film him. We couldn't even fit the camera inside. I'd been in the narrative program at Purchase, and I found myself really drawn to the aspects of the narrative filmmaking that were more documentary in nature, shooting in real locations and sneaking in real people into the films and using non-actors and that kind of thing. We would make frequent trips into the city, and around this time, in the early 90s, Al Lewis had a restaurant in Manhattan on Bleecker Street in the Village called Grampa's Bella Gente, and it was a favorite stop along the way. Basically, to watch stuff like this happen, unfold before your very eyes. You'd stand outside Grampa's and you would see this sort of street theater unfold right before you. It became a tourist stop to go to Grampa's restaurant, not really for the food necessarily, but because you could actually see a living, breathing celebrity. This shot, I wanted to reveal him in a really blasé kind of way, like this is sort of what you've been waiting for, and he's just coming out of the bathroom. So I always found that kind of funny. He would be there hanging around in the restaurant, and people would look in and try to spot Grampa Munster. And this kind of shows you the reach of television. I mean, every single person who walked by there knew who he was, and it's just from seeing him on TV all these years, and there he is. So basically it was a fishbowl, and you could just see Grampa in his natural environment. So after witnessing this many times and eating at Grandpa's and seeing him there, I thought this should really be captured on film, and as far as I had known at the time, nobody else had made a film about him or filmed him in this environment. So I showed up at the restaurant one day and just asked him if I could make a movie out of him, and he said sure. So I think he forgot about it because I started filming every once in a while, and I don't think he knew who I was. Every time I'd have to kind of reintroduce myself. So this is a lesson for film students because I kind of just dove into this without really a plan. I mean, I knew I wanted to make a film about Al Lewis, but I didn't really know what the film was going to be, so I just started filming. I'd initially thought maybe it would be more of a biographical thing about Al Lewis and interview people he worked with and go through his whole career and all that, but it really starts with your subject, and the subject himself couldn't be less interested in what he had done in the past. He couldn't be less interested in the Munsters. So there really wasn't a way to do a straight biographical thing about him, although in the years since there has been a biography episode on him, and they actually showed clips from this film. I had reached out to his agent and did an interview with his agent, and then I reached out to Sylvia Miles, who had done a play with him in the 50s, Iceman Cometh, and tried to interview her in the lobby of her apartment building, and it just it didn't feel right. It didn't feel right to do like a biographical sketch of him. Well, Joe Franklin was appropriate to introduce Al Lewis because Joe is show business, Joe is Broadway, Joe is vaudeville. And I sort of befriended Joe because I was living in Manhattan and wanted to surround myself with people like Joe, so I just showed up at his office one day in the summer when I heard he was moving offices and helped him schlep for a day. I just filled boxes with stuff and walked around Times Square with Joe Franklin. And another film has been made about Joe Franklin called 50 Million Joe Franklin Fans Can't Be Wrong, so check that out. This scene here is pretty much the only biography you get on him, and it basically establishes Al Lewis as a performer. He's not a star, it's just his job to entertain people. There was something really refreshingly unpretentious about it. He just shows up, does his job, and goes home. And he'd basically done every single type of performing you could think of, all the way back to medicine show. And as far as I know, there really isn't anyone left on the planet who can make that claim. But no matter what he's done in his life, and he's done more than just about any performer you can name, he'll always be remembered for this 2 years he spent doing this TV show, The Munsters. And this was just a job that he did. And ever since then, because of reruns and everyone has grown up on this show, wherever he goes, he's recognized as Grandpa. This was made at a time when Al Lewis's media presence was going strong. I think this was the early 90s, and I think it was the first time that a lot of these former TV stars, enough time had gone by from the 60s to the early 90s that they would start to do endorsements. And, Al was doing McDonald's commercials. He did a McDonald's commercial with, like, Bob Denver and a couple of other people. He also had a series of videotapes, Grandpa's Monster Movies, where he would introduce the films in character as Grandpa. He had a commercial for the Junior Vampires Club, and you could call a 900 number and hear a recording of Al. So he was out there more so than he is now. I think that it was just fascinating to sort of think of your own life in terms of what it might be like to be a celebrity. What would it be like to go, to step outside of your house, and wherever you go, people are screaming out the name of this character you played for 2 years, 30 years before. And I guess I wanted to try to capture that experience. And it could have been any celebrity, but it just happened to be Al Lewis because he was accessible, but he's just also such a colorful guy, a true bohemian. I mean, it was perfect that his restaurant was on Bleecker Street in the Village because he was just a real kooky New York character. And what better thing to do than to come from the Midwest and see this genuine sort of fixture. And I think he even compared it to somebody going to see the Sistine Chapel, but instead of that, they would just come to see him. And the way people behave toward him is so interesting because this guy here, he's telling him some real deep inner stuff. He's talking to him about being in recovery to a total stranger, but all these people seem to think that they knew him, and they do know him because he's their grandpa. He's everyone's grandpa. He's your grandpa. There's a familiarity there that he embraces and accepts. I mean, he could easily be a jerk about it and pretend he's better than all that, but he accepts people as they are. And he can talk to anybody. I mean, he talked to the guy in recovery, and it seems as if, even if he hasn't actually been there himself, it seems as if he's been there, and he understands. And he can talk to kids, he can talk to old ladies, he can talk to anybody. So it was so perfect for him to be the figurehead of a restaurant and greet people. I think this is an interesting time period because I think they say nostalgia comes in 20-year waves, and the Munsters was on TV in the early 60s, and by now I guess it's the early 90s, so maybe that's the 30-year wave. But he was starting to ride that wave of nostalgia. I don't think you would have seen... There were some Munsters reunion shows, but he was doing commercials for McDonald's, and the fact that McDonald's was exploiting this sort of feeling of nostalgia and wanting to associate their product with former TV stars, that kind of shows the waves that happened. Now we're in an 80s revival of 80s TV culture. So here's some stills from his show. This is pretty much the only historical background on the show because I liked the show, but I wasn't like I didn't make this movie because I was a fan of the Munsters. I just felt you needed to establish what the hubbub was about, why he's been so identified with this show. Another thing Al had done during this period was appear in Jonathan Demme's Married to the Mob in a small role, and when I saw the film, as soon as he appeared on screen, people went nuts and they started yelling at Grandpa, Grandpa. So that was actually also part of the reason I wanted to make the film. This was all going on around the same time when his visibility was very high. So this is his job. His job is to meet the people and ask if they would like smoking or non-smoking, and it's just so fascinating to watch the people because they really do treat him as if they know him. You wouldn't necessarily go up to an 85-year-old man on the street and pinch his cheek and, give him a noogie, but you can do it with this guy, and he embraces it. I don't really know the whole history of how he got into the restaurant or who the backers were. I mean, I think he was a part owner of the restaurant. But he obviously had some pride in it. He was always going back into the kitchen and making sure that they were doing things the way he wanted to do them. I had no relationship with Al Lewis. I mean, ideally, any documentary is as good as the relationship you have with its subject, and I had no relationship to Al Lewis. Matter of fact, I had mentioned that he kept sort of forgetting who I was, and every time I'd show up with a camera, I'd have to reintroduce myself. Well, we went on this trip here that you see. We went to Philadelphia with him on a train, and... we were following him around, and he saw us following him, and I think somewhere in his head he may have remembered, but somebody asked him on the train who we were and what we were doing, and I remember him saying, "I have no idea." And that was kind of humbling, I guess. And I think the film only scratches the surface of this guy only because I had no relationship with him. So I guess that's why I sort of wanted to look at him from the outside looking in, like those people outside the restaurant looking in through a fishbowl, because it was sort of the experience of meeting a celebrity and not quite knowing how to behave around him. So Al lived and lives on Roosevelt Island, which is off of the island of Manhattan, and he's the most famous resident of Roosevelt Island. So we filmed this interview in a diner in Al's building, the bottom floor of Al's building, and Al wouldn't let me come up to his apartment, so another indication of our lack of a relationship. Now, this interview here, another tip for film students, never do your own sound. Because we were doing this interview, and Stephen Altabello, my good friend and fellow filmmaker, he shot this interview. We started rolling on this, and we got about 5 minutes of film going, and he's answering this question of what is your name, age, and occupation. And then I looked down at our Nagra, and I realized that we weren't really rolling. The machine was on, but we weren't rolling, and I had to stop the machine and admit to Al, I screwed this up, and we're going to have to start it again. And that was really also another humbling moment. So never be your own sound man. The other thing was we had put the microphone on him, and we were trying to hide the mic in his clothes. And, he had done so many interviews and TV, he was saying, "Hide the mic. What do you want to hide the mic for?" So he was a little impatient with us, but he was also supportive at the same time. He let me do this movie. He didn't have to do that. There was also a subplot that we had thought about including of Al's son, Ted, who would work at the restaurant and just sort of hang out there. And I thought for a little while, well, maybe this is an angle, the son sort of taking over for his dad and learning from the master. But that was just not that interesting. And so that's my favorite moment of the whole film. This is an example of the familiarity that people have with him. I mean, these kids were, yeah, okay. You wouldn't do that to an 85-year-old man that you just saw on the street. You just wouldn't do that. But Al embraces it, and he lets it happen, and he seems to enjoy it. These scenes are very important, too, because this is sort of the life of a performer. There's a lot of solitary hours. There's a lot of travel. You sit in hotel rooms and watch the game until you're ready to go on. And this is kind of why I wanted to make the film. I really wanted to show that this is a job like any other job, and it's hard work. And here is Al getting into his grandpa costume, which isn't really a costume, it's just a tux. And, all throughout this, I would throw out questions to him about his life, his career, people he'd worked with, and it just didn't feel right. It didn't feel like that was what the film should be about. So there is a lot of footage of that, but it's not here anymore because we wanted to boil it down to the basics of what this job is all about. And here, okay, this was gold. I mean, when we shot this scene and Philip Harrison was the cameraman on this, we knew this was probably going to be the most important scene in the film because it's obviously so intimate and so simple and so funny also. And he's done this so many times. And he's just going on the road and doing his act. And it's wonderful. And his wonderful line that you couldn't write this line.
I don't think they'll mistake me for anything other than Grandpa.
Yeah, wonderful. So the context of that trip was a Miller Beer corporate event, and I think they were rewarding the distributors of beer with a party where they would get to see Grandpa live in person. Now here's an example of the tour buses that would pull up. Every day, every minute, this was going on, and I just felt it had to be filmed. And here is this lady who, it's like you would take a picture of a statue with pigeons on its head. Instead, you're taking a picture of this real guy. One of the people that came up to Al here when we were filming him outside the restaurant was a guy, I guess a TV fan, and he was asking Al questions about different stars he'd worked with. And he asked him about Lucille Ball. He said, "Oh, I heard you worked with Lucille Ball." And Al said, "Yes." And he asked Al what she was like, and he said, "Demeaning, condescending, terrible person. As far as I'm concerned, fuck her, let her burn in hell." That came straight out of his mouth. Of course, it's not on camera, it's not on film, but that's the truth about Lucille Ball from Al Lewis.
What you did yesterday?
Me?
Oh, here she is.
Not you, but one can.
Trying to get some actor studio type of wisdom from the performer with many, many years of experience, and he just wasn't having any of it. And I think she wanted some advice on the actor's life. This really kind of sums up Al's attitude toward his life and toward his work. He just gets out there and does it. And that's, I think, something that today's performers just don't have. I mean, he's had 80 years to perfect his act. And today's performers just don't have that. They get discovered, and then they're launched into superstardom without any kind of training. And Al Lewis, getting up on the high wire at a circus, you can't screw up. You just got to get out there and do it. And that really forms your personality, I would assume. So here we are back in Philadelphia, and the various Miller beer people that we encountered. And there's a lot of footage of this. There's some other sort of characters that we encountered along the way who didn't make it into the final cut. An awkward moment here with Al completely unimpressed what he's about to enter into.
I have to card this guy to make sure he's under 21.
So here's our big party montage. The party here, like I said, was a Miller beer party where Al Lewis was paid a wage to just show up and walk around. So the music here was recorded at film school by our friend Brian Wongrowski and his band called Honk. And we recorded a sort of a Surfing Ventures version of the Munsters theme song for this party. And another tip to film students, bring lights. We didn't bring any lights, so there was somebody else videotaping, and we just followed them around because they had lights. So we got in their way a lot. Stephen Altabella was also at this event here taking sound. Yeah, so as you can see, we kind of were limited to where we could go because we didn't have lights, so we just stuck to where there were lights. This, I think, that was me filming that. And here's this wonderful montage of people having their one-on-one time with Grandpa Al. And he has maybe 3 or 4 different faces that he puts on. There's one of them. And he's a pro. Look at that. How great. How great. This is one of the Miller Beer girls that was there for the event, and I love this here. It's a very solitary life here, I think, being on the road, and there it is. It's just having a moment. No problem. I think he said that about 500 times a day. So look, this is total vaudeville right here. I was just so impressed with this. It's so easy for him, judging the costume contest here. And this film doesn't touch on Al's history too much, but I think it's important to note his history as a real rabble-rouser and very active politically, so much so that he actually ran for governor on the Green ticket a few years back, and he was trying to use his celebrity status to get the Green Party permanently on the ballot in New York State. He also ran for mayor under the Green Party banner. His politics are very progressive and very left-leaning, and he puts his money where his mouth is, and he ran for governor. He also had a radio talk show on WBAI. Here's one of these tour buses. Every night the tour buses would pull up, and Al would get on the bus and do what you're about to see.
Enjoy yourself.
Look how happy he's making people. I think this is so touching, and he seems to get some pleasure out of this.
Thank you. Thank you.
This interview was extremely long because this was the only time I'd get to sit down with him, so I think he got a little tired. He just wrapped it up with that incredible soliloquy about want versus need. And then, wow, okay, interview's done. He just pulled that out after when things started to wane a little bit. This is pure street philosophy right here. And I've often thought about this, and I think anyone can apply this to their own lives, about finding a passion and finding their calling in life, whatever that might be. The question of want versus need. You will not find his likes again. And as of this recording, he's in his mid-90s, and he's this past summer he had a serious health problem and had one of his legs removed. So he's not as visible as he once was. But he's still with us. Grandpa's was in existence for a number of years and did very well. Obviously, the tour buses helped, and it was packed every day for lunch and for dinner, and it was a fiesta every night. But it did go out of business. It closed its doors probably in the mid-90s, and now I don't know what's there now. It's on the corner of Bleecker and something. Now, this fellow here, I thought it was important to include him in the film because this is a street performer that just randomly was playing outside of Grandpa's one night. It was around Halloween time. And I felt it was important to include this because there's really a very short distance between Al Lewis, a world-famous personality, and this guy who's singing for his supper the same way Al Lewis is doing, but on obviously a very different scale. And I don't know who this guy is, and he's probably about Al's age, maybe a little younger. After I finished the film, of course, I wanted Al to see it. But before I sent it to him, I said, hey, I'm almost done with the film. I wanted to give you a copy. And he said, oh, you can send it to me, but I won't watch it. Maybe I'll show it to my kids. And I thought that was interesting because he's just not interested in anything he's ever done, really, to see it. It's really a job. His job is to entertain people, and it begins and ends the day that he does the job. So to this day, I don't know if he's seen the film. I'm very happy that this little chunk of show business history is recorded on film. As far as I know, this is it. There might be some news reports about it or something, but this sort of captures what was happening in the early 90s here, when you could walk down the street and be pretty much guaranteed to see a fixture, a show business fixture, and an icon, and a piece of your own childhood. And he'd be happy to shake your hand and greet you, and maybe pinch his cheek if you were so bold. This has been Al Lewis in the Flesh. Thanks for watching, and watch it again.